anyone. Good afternoon for people of all Americas. Good night for people in Europe, and maybe good morning for people in Asia. Today, we are making our first international webinar of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. And we have the pleasure to have with us Professor Amitava Krishna Dutt, that will talk about varieties of Structuralist development, macroeconomics, and evaluation. I will present Professor Amitava Dutt. He is Professor of Economics and Political Science, Fellow from Kellogg Institute of International Studies, Kroc Institution of International Peace Studies, Liu Institute of Asia and Asia Studies. Professor Dutt's areas of specialization are macroeconomic theory, development economics, international economics, political economy, and international political economy. His current research focuses on global uneven development and globalization, models of growth and distribution, consumption and happiness, and the ethics and methodology of political economy. He's the author or editor of several books, including Growth, Distribution, and Uneven Development from Cambridge University Press, 1990, Keynes' Third Alternative, co-authored with my former master supervisor, Professor Eduardo Amadeu, from Edward Elgar, 1990, International Handbook of Development Economics in 2 volumes, co-edited with Jaime Ross, Happiness, Economics and Politics, co-edited with Radcliffe, Economics and Ethics, co-authored with Wilbur, Palgrave Macmillan, 2010, Pathways to Economic Development, Oxford, 2014, and Happiness, A Quick Immersion, co-authored with Radcliffe, TBW Publishers, 2019, and the author of numerous papers published in edited volumes and journals, including American Economic Review, Cambridge Journal of Economics, Economic Letters, History of Political Economy, International Review of Applied Economics, Journal of Comparative Economics, Journal of Development Economics, Journal of Development Studies, Journal of Economic Surveys, Journal of Institutional Economics, Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, Macroeconomic Dynamics, Macroeconomica, Oxford Economic Papers, Review of Keynesian Economics, Review of Political Economy, Review of Radical Economics and World Development. He is also the co-editor of international journals, Macroeconomica and Review of Social Economy. He is also Distinguished Professor of Economics at Flasco in Ecuador. He previously served as chairperson of the economics department at Notre, and he has been visiting professor and scholar at various universities, including the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, University of São Paulo, Cambridge University, University of Paris 1, University of Paris 13, University of Pavia, University of Innsbruck, and UNAM in Mexico City. So we have with us today, also with Professor Dutt, we have the economist José Gabriel Porcillo Meirelles from ECLAC. Now he's in Uruguay. You are the head of the office at Uruguay, isn't it, Gabriel?
Yes, I'm the head and only staff. So I have I give the orders and I obey.
Okay. And we also have the pleasure to have with us Kersia Kamenach. She is the president of the Regional Council of Economics of the state of Goiás, and she gives us the technical support for having this webinar today. Many thanks, Kersia. Welcome. And so, without any delays, Professor Dutt, please, the audience is yours. You have more or less 45 minutes to present, and you can begin.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And since yours is institution that focuses on structuralist development, macroeconomics, I thought I would bring the cold to Newcastle, as it were, by talking about structures, structuralism, and economic development. So, what I will be doing is to talk a little bit about what structuralist development economics is. It is seen as one of the major approaches to the study of economic development, right from the so-called birth of the subject after Second World War. For example, Hollis Chenery, Pranab Bardhan, I.M.D. Little, and others talked about three broad schools. One is Marxist, one is neoclassical, and one is structuralist institutionalist. So it was recognized as one of the major approaches. Now, it was quite strong during the early phase of development. That is, if we call development as the subject that emerged after World War II, but then it weakened considerably. But now it is rising again, a resurrection, if you will, including, I'm happy to see, in Brazil. Now, as the name suggests, the approach focuses on structures, okay, that affect economic development. That is, structures of the global economy, structures within economies, and also on the need for structural change. But what are structures? Okay, that is the big question. So I will make some introductory comments about structural approach as an alternative to, say, the mainstream approach, which is the neoclassical one, and also note the close links that have existed, although they're not very clear, between structuralist economics and the other social sciences. So, for example, in linguistics, sociology, social anthropology, and political economy, including Marxian political economy. Now, as I said, one way of comparing what can be called structuralist is by contrasting it to the mainstream approach, which is the neoclassical one. And one can do so under three heads. One is what you might call the organizing principle. How does one organize thinking about the economy? And I want to stress, by organizing principle, I don't mean how you view the economy, but with what approach you view it. So this approach can be something that has nothing to say about the world itself, but about what is the meaning of knowledge. So you might call it epistemological approach. So what does the neoclassical or mainstream approach emphasize as organizing principle? As is well known, it is the optimizing agent. In other words, the so-called rational individual and methodological individualism. I disagree with both of these ideas, but they have to be stated. The structuralist, on the other hand, looks at structures of the system as a whole and how this structure changes. So the focus is much more on the big picture and the structures within it than focusing on the individual. Now, these two are not necessarily contradictory with each other because they can be thought of as starting points. But of course, neoclassical economists have to look at how the economy is structured as well, because they usually do it in terms of sort of markets and some Walrasian market economies and so forth. And structuralists also has views about the individual, which I'll come to later. Now, if you look at how to view the economy, then the neoclassical approach is focused on economies being more or less similar, okay, that you can think of them all as having markets, and these markets work efficiently. And even if there are different distortions and you can have different parameter values, they can be looked at as very similar using, say, as I mentioned, the Walrasian or maybe the Marshallian partial equilibrium approach or game theory approaches and things of that sort. Structuralist approaches focus on differences between economies and societies. They focus on, therefore, structural differences, not treating everything as similar. And they also incorporate what are called non-economic factors in a very central way, and also focus on what can be called power relations. Now, the policies are neoclassical approach is generally the neoliberal free market approach, but there are variants which say, no, the government does have a role to remove the influence of distortions and even to reduce poverty and perhaps maybe even inequality. Whereas for the structuralists, the government plays a very important role in how they affect markets with a view to promoting development, and which includes concerns about income distribution and inequality, and also through structural changes that don't occur by themselves. Now, let me say just a few words about how structuralism relates to other social sciences. Um, it started maybe a long time ago without the name being put to it, but the structuralist approach name was used by the linguists, for example, Saussure and others, who focused not on individual words, but the entire structure of languages. And you also had Levi Strauss, the social anthropologist, some psychologists, and you can think of Marx, at least the later Marx, as being very focused on structures. Althusser, for example, has distinguished between the early humanist Marx and the later structuralist Marx, and I'll come back to this theme later on. Okay, so what I will do is 5 things, if I have the time. Jose Luis, do you think you can give me some warnings about times? No? Okay. I will try to keep an eye on it. So what I will do is to focus on 5 things. One is describe very quickly what is called the early structuralist approaches in development economics. Then look at the later structuralist approaches after what you might call the resurrection of structuralist approaches. And this includes, of course, the Brazilian contributions, but also others. I mean no lack of respect for Brazilians, but it's not the only place where the resurrection is taking place. Okay.
Yes, Professor Dutt, don't worry about the time. I will control it. Right? Yeah,
How will you control it?
No, you
Okay.
ask. You
No,
ask
yes,
if it
yes. You give
advice.
me some warnings, okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
don't worry. I will
Yeah.
go now to outside
Okay.
the room, but take your time. No
Okay.
problem.
And then after looking at the early and later structuralists, I will try to give you an account of what I think are the major elements of it. First, in terms of theory, which is in terms of epistemology, ontology, and axiology, which look at organizing principles, how the world is viewed, and the normative dimension. And then I will also briefly comment on policy approaches, what it says, and then to recognize some potential weaknesses. I say potential because I don't think they're major weaknesses, which cannot be overcome. But I think if you forget about them, that will lead to problems. Okay, so early structures approaches. I'm not going to go into much detail about this because I think this is a story well known to most of you. So in the early period after the Second World War, there were two strands that have been called structuralist. So it's not a single approach. And this has been called the European US strand and the Latin American strand, mostly based in Cepal, but also in Brazil, of people connected with Cepal and others. So some people just think of the European branch as structuralist. For example, Arndt, who has Heinz, I think, has focused on them primarily, and others like Gabriel Palma and others have focused more on the Latin American branch. But I think both have a claim to be the early developers of the structuralist development economics. Now, I will just not go into details, but just mention the main names like P.N. Rosenstein Rodan, Ragnar Nertze, Hans Singer, Arthur Lewis, Gunnar Myrdal, and later people like Hollis Chenery and Dudley Sears. Now, they have been characterized in Chenery's words as focusing on specific rigidities, lags, and other specific characteristics. Little's, IMD Little's characterizes them as seeing the world as inflexible because of obstacle, bottlenecks, constraints. And these make them very different from what he called developed countries, okay? Because it doesn't allow the normal operation of markets which do wonderful things. And Heinz Arndt focuses on issues of signaling, issues of responsiveness, and other issues that prevent the operation of the good operation of markets, the efficient operation of markets. So you can see they're similar. They focus on rigidities and bottlenecks and what you might call distortions. So let me skip this part of going into details, but mention some ideas among them. For example, the idea of the vicious cycle that traps countries to low levels of development. Also, Arthur Lewis's discussion of what he called the classical approach with surplus labor and the dual economy, which is a structural characteristic of these countries, and Hans Singer, and Myrdal, who focus more on international factors like the terms of trade and uneven development. These, as you'll see, will be closely related to the Latin American branch. So the Latin American branch is mainly, the main contributors are Raul Prebisch from Cepal and Celso, I think, Furtado from Brazil. And their main contributions were to focus on structural differences, not rigidities and things of that sort, but really structural differences. So, for example, Prebisch talks about the structure of the global economy as being differentiated between the center and the periphery, where the center was more or less exporting manufactured goods, and the periphery largely primary products. And and this led to an international division of labor based on different kinds of exports, but also Prebisch focused on structural differences within the high income and low income countries. For example, high income countries had large corporations. They also had tighter labor markets. They also had high levels of technology, and also they had unions, labor unions, which provided some power to workers. And the periphery, of course, was different in having underemployment, in having small producers as well as a few large ones, and and they were technologically very differentiated. Parts of it were connected with the center, but others were not, and they might be called even subsistence sectors. And Prebisch argued that the way forward was industrialization, not as an end, but as a way of creating jobs and raising living standards. And he focused on both import substitution, but also export promotion to change the pattern of specialization. Furtado took a much broader approach, focused explicitly on distributional issues and on historical and structural approaches to examine structural change, focusing on how the current world system is the product of history and the colonial system, and how social and cultural factors, for example, the tendency of the elites in the lower income periphery to want to ape the habits of rich people in rich countries through their consumption, and also that they were very dependent on the technology created in rich countries. And this resulted in all kinds of problems, including what he called external disequilibrium with chronic foreign exchange problems. And this was because, in large part, they had to import certain goods which they cannot produce, especially investment goods, but also because their currency was not global currencies. Okay, the dollar and maybe the pound sterling before that were the global currencies, so they had to import by paying for it with foreign exchange. So this created um, um, a world that was divided. And Furtado, who was writing after Prebisch, did not focus so much on import substituting industrialization, but more on how to promote private investment, on land reform, and other policies for changing the structure of the economies. There were other contributors, but I will not discuss them. Let me just mention Noela Vasquez and Osvaldo Sunkel and Anibal Pinto, but I'll just skip that for now. Now, the early structuralist approach fell out of prominence to some extent by an assault from neoclassical economics. And the story is well known, the rise of neoliberalism, market-based approaches, and so forth, which were critical of the structuralist ideas. For example, Deepak Lal, I'm afraid I'm from the same country he came from, but I apologize for him. I talked about the poverty of development economics. And then from dependency scholars in Latin America and elsewhere. And so there was also a rise of thinking that you must attend to basic needs and not try to develop by industrialization directly. Now, I would classify the newer approaches into 5 groups. The 5 groups, one is what is called structuralist macroeconomics, This was largely developed by my thesis advisor, Lance Taylor, and it used a mathematical approach to examine institutions and patterns of behavior that affect economic growth, income distribution, and different ways in which markets and the state operated. And it drew on ideas from Keynes, Kalecki, Ricardo, Marx, and even some neoclassical ideas. So this was mainly a formalization of ideas using macroeconomic theory, but it discussed many aspects of that were discussed by the early structuralists, including income distribution, how it affects growth, how it affects aggregate demand, external considerations, including north-south models. Then you have the neostructuralism of Cepal. This has three features. One is technological upgrading. Second is reducing inequality and poverty. And third is making the state more responsive. Okay, but it also kept the old ideas of Cepal structuralism, including the international division of labor and foreign exchange problems. But it has been criticized for becoming a little too open to some neoclassical ideas and not emphasizing power relations within countries and also globally. Although this criticism can be contested. For example, by my friend Jose Antonio Ocampo, who's one of the people who write in this tradition. Then you have the technological upgrading, who draw on Schumpeter, evolutionary approaches, and focus on moving up the technology ladder through industry studies, through studying how technological institutes develop, and they focus on discrete rather than marginal changes which require state intervention. So this is more technology studies, approaches, and focusing on technology, which is, notice, also a part of the Cepal new structuralism. Then we have the new developmentalism of Bresser Pereira and others who are you more familiar with. I think they focus on aggregate demand and how that causes inequality and demand deficiency, but they also focus on the real exchange rate for promoting manufacturing exports and to avoid excessive foreign debt and excessive government deficits. And they, to some extent, follow Furtado, but also other features of the old structuralist ideas, but I think focus quite a lot on income distribution and inequality, and they see promoting manufacturing exports through exchange rate policy as central, but also discuss technological upgrading like the two previous schools. And finally, and for completeness, I will mention Justin Lin and the new structural economics or neoclassical structural economics, which I've tried to understand, but he is basically trying to say that neoclassical economics can be suitably modified to take into account some of the problems of structural characteristics. And mainly he talks about how the government can play some role in creating infrastructure institutions, although in a limited way, and basically uses a broad version of the Heckscher-Ohlin full employment model. And there's an interesting debate between Ha-Joon Chang and Justin Lin, who was, I think, the chief economist at the World Bank, which I don't find particularly persuasive. It's more playing with words, but Justin Lin still calls himself structuralist. There are also some other approaches that are not explicitly called structuralist, which have got some amount of attention. They are the development traps. There's a low-level trap, which actually try to formalize older views of vicious cycles that I mentioned, with unstable equilibria, which leads you back to the low-level trap. And then you have the somewhat different middle income trap literature, which focuses a lot on the problems of technological upgrading. Okay. Now let me talk about how does all this fit together? What is the common feature of any? And this is a problem because people love to use structure without really clarifying what they mean by it in precise forms. So I would like to distinguish between epistemological issues concerning what we mean by explaining and the ontological issues about how one thinks of as the essential features of the world. This is, although the words come from Greek, I am not using them in the same sense as the Greek writers did for obvious reasons. That is, well, I don't need to get into that, but we can bring it up later if we want. Okay, so the organizing principle, as I mentioned before, is to look at the whole system. By whole system, I don't mean everything that exists, like the universe, but the whole relevant system being studied. There is, in principle, possible to study the family in structuralist terms, where the family is the system. But of course, you need to take into account the possibility that families have relations with others outside the family. So the whole system, with looking at how the structure is given at a point in time, but also how it changes over time. Okay, so this relates again to the linguistic idea that you don't focus on individual words, like you don't focus on individual people, but you see them in the context of the entire structures, structural characteristics of the language, and so on. And these are not obvious just from looking at facts, that you have to study it, its historical development of the society, to see what are the important features of this structure. Incidentally, this connection of structuralism to the other structuralism in social sciences, for example, people like Levi Strauss have been criticized for taking structures as given, okay, and focusing on what is called maybe the structures at a given point in time, but others who study, for example, economic development, like Celso Furtado, also looks at in terms of historical developments and structural change. And this feature of looking at the whole system rather than the optimizing agent is actually the key feature of this organizing principle. The Latin American school is more explicit in this, focusing on structures, because Prebisch and Furtado, both of them, looked and emphasized on structures, but most of the European and American scholars of structuralism, as I mentioned before, looked at rigidities and distortions and used the language of market failures, which is really more following the methodological individualist rational approach of neoclassical economics, and modifying it, although as it turns out, you can start with anything and end up anywhere. Okay, so you can start with methodological individualism and put distortions to make it say similar things to the structuralists of Latin America did without starting from that starting point. And the formal representation of this has, I think, most developed by Lance Taylor and others when they look at accounting identities, both flow identities and stock identities, and fill it with behavioral and institutional relations using what has been called different closing rules to understand the system. So you can have a neo-Marxian system, a Kalecki Keynesian system, but also combinations of system, one part of the system following one pattern, another part following another pattern, for instance. Now, the views of the world, the ontology of structuralism is, of course, tries to make explicit the structures. What are the important drivers of development? And this is already implicit in the idea of center and periphery, as mentioned by Prebisch, in terms of pattern of specialization, in the pattern of power that results in some currencies as being international currencies, the dominance of technology, and also cultural domination of one group by another group, often rewriting history to say that everything worthwhile started in Europe, okay, forgetting the many, many contributions of other parts of the world to culture, much of which was drawn on by European scholars. Now, the structure of developing countries in particular focused on many, many sectors, okay, in terms of peasants, surplus labor, different land tenure systems with tenancy, the importance of transnational corporations as enclaves in this large economy, which also had very, very simple, informal sectors. And as I said before, you can compare the classical Marxian and Keynes-Kalecki views of the world focusing on aggregate demand and exogenously given, politically determined income distribution to the neoclassical approach, which is basically follows full employment approach, maybe at most with some distortions. And there are extensions to deal with technological change, finance, sectoral interactions, fiscal constraints and government debt, open economy issues like exchange rate and foreign exchange constraints, and North-South interaction, which incidentally tries to formalize some of the ideas of not only the structuralists, but also the dependency schools. And they have many implications, for example, that I mostly ignored till recently by the mainstream, which is what determines growth and the relationship between economic growth and income distribution. What causes uneven development or catch up for that matter, okay? What is the nature of external versus internal constraints on development? And how does political and social factors interact with more narrowly economic factors? So all of these are part of the study of the real world. Neoclassical economics has now entered into studies of institutions and what they call imperialism, not in the sense of actual imperialism, but the economics of imperializing other subjects through the works of people like Gary Becker and others, using the optimizing approach to study not only economics, which is a bad idea, I think, but also everything else through rational choice approaches. Normatively speaking, the early focus was on growth, but increasingly it has focused on inequality, poverty, including vulnerability and social exclusion, and exclusion from decision making at the political level too. I will not go into the policy differences very much, except clearly you cannot have the same policy of promoting markets everywhere. You need to take into account specific characteristics and macro and sectoral policies that have to be examined, not just monetary and fiscal policy to stabilize the economy and let market incentives work. And we cannot use narrowly technocratic economistic policies, but take into account broader social, political, and other issues. Yes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Okay, and then the approach applied to today's world has to take into account some features. That one is the global system has now much more focused on lower levels of tariff protection. Okay, now I don't know why we have to follow it, but that is what many people believe. I mean, nothing to prevent countries from getting out of WTO, for example. Okay, it's an issue worth considering. But anyway, low levels of tariff protection. So you got to play with the rules and have industrial and other policies. Then we have relatively developed financial markets, especially short-term capital flows, which can cause all kinds of troubles. You have semi-industrialized countries, especially middle-income countries like Brazil and India and certainly China. And you have also trade in intermediate goods, which is a large part of world trade through these production networks, which makes it difficult to distinguish between primary producers and high-skilled manufacturing producers, because goods are not produced in one place. But I want to mention that this does not negate the fact that some countries are more involved in less technical skilled assembly operations or various technologies, sectors that produce things without much technological complexity, and others that actually run the show in terms of technology and in terms of power and in terms of where the more high levels of intellectual property and protection are based. I won't go into the specifics of policies, except to note that there is a lot of emphasis on inequality and how to reduce it, looking at things like industrial structure, looking at labor unions, but also focusing on industrial policies as well as exchange rate policies. This is particularly emphasized in Brazil, but also looking at technology policies and upgrading. And generally following macroeconomic policies that focus more on more expansionary, although not hyper expansionary stances to improve income distribution and promote growth without having domestic or international debt buildup. Okay, so there are constraints. Let me now mention in my remaining time some potential problems that are often not emphasized enough. One of them deals with individuals. Now, I do not give much weight to the criticisms of that these lack micro foundations, whether it is macroeconomics of a Keynesian kind or a structuralist kind, because they don't follow methodological individualism and don't have rational choice, whatever that means. I think that these are not very meaningful criticisms just because we think, as Descartes said, it's not obvious that we are, okay? And that it is only intellectual hubris that makes us think of individuals as the starting point of all analysis. And even that it's rational is very unclear because it's not clear what rationality means. To give you an example, I think it's much better to think of individuals as divided selves or multiple selves, which again don't have a preference ordering over these selves like people like Sen would talk about, but there are dialectics involved. There are conflicts between the different selves. Okay, we can think of it in terms of comic books where there's the devil on one side and angel on the other side that are constantly fighting with each other, and which one will win will depend on social factors, what classes there are, what the social norms are. We are not independent decision makers. But the more important thing, I believe, and this is what structuralism does not emphasize, is the problem of who individuals are. We can't just say we are something. We are all capable of change and self improvement. And if we only focus on structures, we ignore what is also a very, very important part of society, which is how individuals can improve themselves and depart from self seeking, greedy behavior to other kinds, which are, of course, affected by structures. They have not been helped by capitalism so much, which, as we know, promotes greed and self interest. The other issue is about dealing with things like institutions, political economy and power, historical processes, expectations in the future. I would like to submit that structuralism is not antithetical to any of these. In fact, some of the aspect of structure refers to institutions and their institutional rigidities. It is changes in institutions and the nature of institutions are determined by power and political economy. Uh, they are the result of historical processes that create path dependencies, but they're also based on expectations about the future. But these expectations also are not just random and anybody can have any expectations. Part of it was analyzed, of course, by John Maynard Keynes, but some of it also by sociologists, by James Beckett. But I think it is important to take into account that expectations are formed more by powerful people and by historical factors than we believe. That you can't just say development of the state of mind and say, oh, we are not underdeveloped anymore. Okay, so there is room for individual improvement, but there is room for collective action and power struggle. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Dutt, many thanks for your beautiful presentation. I think that now we have some time for discussion. As the chair of this section, I had the pleasure to make the first comments. The first comment regarding the definition of structuralism. I have a more narrow definition for me, and it's a very economical definition. Structuralism is the idea, developmentalism is the basic idea that the structure of production and employment matters for long-run growth. So this idea is present, for instance, in the later writings of Nicholas Calder. This same idea is presented on the last book of Anthony Tyrrell, The Economic Growth in an Open Developing Economy. This is a chapter 3 if I was correct, where he explains why the structure of production matters for long-run growth. And the same idea is presented by the economic historian Eric Heinert with his book, How the Rich Countries Became Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor. So for me, structuralism is this idea, the idea that structure matters for long-run development. So if you had the wrong structure means the combination of decreasing returns activities with perfect competition. Is basically the case of the Brazilian economy today, that we reverted to a country that is basically a primary export instead of a manufacturing export country that we was until the 80s. Yeah? And you have the right structure is the combination of increasing returns activities with imperfect competition, that which is basically the manufacturing industry and the high intensive technology services. So that's for me the basic idea of why structure matters for long-run development. My second comment is that I like your description of new developmentalism. Thanks so much. It's a much better description than the one made by Thomas Pelly on his rebuttal to my article with Luis Fernando de Paula at Investigación Económica. Yes, we new developmentalists talk about the structural change, and we think that the post-industrial society that Mr. Pelly is talking about has already existed in Brazil, and it's not a good thing for us, because the post-industrial society that we have now in our country after 20 or 30 years of premature deindustrialization is a society that reverted to a Leo's economy. We have a decreasing modern sector and an increasing subsistence sector. That is the post-industrial society that Mr. Pelly defends for my country. And I don't think that's good for the Brazilian people and for the future of this country. And one last comment: why you don't? What do you think about the contribution of Luigi Pasinetti to the structural change issues? And he cannot be considered a structuralist at some kind. Well, that's my comments. I think that Gabriel has another issue.
Yes, thank you, José Luis. Yeah, a brief comment and a question. The brief comment is that when you look at the intellectual production of ECLAC, there is a period in the early 90s until 1988 when José Antonio, there is a period in which the intellectual production in ECLAC became more neoclassical, something more similar to the new structuralism of Justin Lee. But when José Antonio Campo came to ECLAC in 1988, I think, and the subsequent work under Secretary Executive Alicia Bárcena, I believe that ECLAC came back very much to the old roots, heterodox structuralist roots, and succeeded to some extent to introduce these power relations in the not in informal terms, but in the discussion of the problems of development. This more political economy and power relations became more important with José Antonio and with Alicia. So this is something that it's not so linear. I mean, the evolution, and there are some points in which there are changes that I think are important, and I would highlight the role of Jose Antonio Analicia. The question is the following: we work. I mean, there is for the structuralists there is a kind of trap. As you mentioned, you need a discrete jump in terms of technological catching up and structural change in order to overcome a low growth trap, a low income trap, or a middle income trap. The question is there any form of introducing the institutional dynamics within our models? We have been trying to do this with Diego Sanchez and Cochea, who you mentioned in your presentation. So, is there any direction that you may suggest us about how to include these institutions, how to include the institutions and the institutional dynamics in our model? Because I have the impression that as the political economy of the country depends so much on the production structure, with the rentiers being so much powerful, financial rentiers and natural resources rentiers in our economies, that there is also a political economy and institutional trap that we cannot, that it's too difficult to overcome. It's not just to say, let's apply the right policy and we will be free of the middle income trap, because the institutions and the political economy are part of this middle income trap. Any suggestion in this direction is welcome. Thank you.
Well, there is a question made by Luis Fernando de Paula, who is a professor at the Institute of Economics of Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and he was my co-author in the reply to Mr. Pally. Luis Fernando de Paula asks, how can development theory interact with macrofinance theories, such as that inspired Minsky and others? How to interact productive and financial sector forces in a structuralist approach? Well, I think that we have three questions we can now answer.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I did not have a pencil to write these down, so I might have to ask you to remind me.
Right.
I will try to address all of them. Now, I think I'd like to focus on the meaning of structures in a very broad way that I did, okay? Because I'm not convinced that production structure, by which I think you mean structure of sectoral composition,
Yes, sectoral composition
of output like agriculture, industry, or types of industries is as important as many other issues. Okay, and I think they increasingly becoming less important as technological change occurs. Okay, look, we are actually getting into a world where how many people will be required to do work, okay, is with artificial intelligence, robotics, okay, where who will be employed will mainly be the technological experts and service sector people, okay, who will have to deal with individuals. Even teachers might have to disappear, okay, because we can be replaced by video, because all you need to learn is information, not knowledge, whatever that means. So I still think that structures should not only include production sectors, but also Marxian social relations structures, let us say, structures of thinking, of knowledge, okay, but because all of these have to be considered. Okay, so for example, the distinction between finance and industry that was mentioned by Professor Porcile, is it? Yeah. Okay. How does that fit into this framework? Okay. Increasingly, I see finance becoming the ruler of everything, and to me, that is the essence of capitalism. How to make money by magic, and how to put it in a few hands. Okay. Now, this is the whole idea of capitalism.
Yeah.
And all this talk about creating employment and creating new ideas is, I think, nonsense. Nobody is interested in that. Maybe they were in the beginning. All they want is money and power. Okay. And how to go to the moon or outer space. I wish they would just buy one-way tickets, though. These people like Bezos and all of this. So I think structures of different kinds are important. I'm not disputing that production structures may be important, but I don't see why the old pattern of large-scale production along historical lines of the Industrial Revolution should be the path we all follow. What is life about? It is about how to live together cooperatively and not just getting richer and richer and richer. Okay, even happiness studies tells us that. Okay, so can we
Yes.
live? I mean, with technological changes and with these 3D copy machines, we can produce manufactured goods in a very small scale. Okay, I think you can also produce guns and use them uh, with these copiers. So even small scale sectors can be operating. So and if we just industrialize in the good old ways, what's going to happen to the natural environment? Okay, and what will happen to people's as people? Okay, and not as tools and machines, as even Adam Smith told us. Okay, now I don't want to defend Tom, who is my friend too. Uh, I don't always agree with him, but I don't always disagree with him. Okay, I will leave it at that. About Pasinetti, yeah, certainly he can be included somewhere, but I didn't think of him as a central figure in what I was talking about, because I think he focuses a lot on sectoral differences and how different sectors have different technologies and have different elasticities of demand, which leads to structural change. I don't think, again, as I said before, that that is a key key issue. He is, I think, too involved in this Straffian production dynamics and things like that. Of course, there are important contributions, and I'm a great fan of his writing. But again, I didn't think him central to the discussions that we were involved with. I agree with technology and finance, but again, I tend to think that you not everything can be put into a model. Okay, you can put some things in the model which are more general and law-like. And what macroeconomics can do is much more to look into the effects of certain things and what to avoid. Okay. Now, I think we are too wedded to technology for its own sake. Okay, I think technology, despite iPhones and personal computers, which I love, okay, most of technological change has been utterly destructive. Look at the nuclear weapons. Okay, look at the what has happened to the richest country in the world, where people have no education and no ideas except television and internet nonsense. Okay, uh, also, how is this going to affect who will have jobs? We will, the real post-industrial, let me call it the post-economic world, okay, is one where Economics should stop dominating all the subjects and recognize its limits. Economics and material production is only part of the story, but we have to deal with human relationships, we have to deal with self-knowledge, we have to deal with nature. All of these things are much more important than having skyscrapers and shopping malls and fast and faster trains for and all kinds of these changes. So although I think technological changes have to be studied, it is not done so easily with models, but with industry studies. But the effect of these changes needs to be looked at through not the way of technology solves all the problems. Okay, we know it solves some problems, but it creates many, many more, I think. Okay, television is a great technology, but it's also the single most destructive thing that has happened to the world for a while, and now the internet is probably, despite its many positives, so it is going to have a big effect, I think. About the question from
Luis Fernando de Paula.
yes, what was
I can repeat to you.
yes?
How can development theory interact with microfinance theories, such as that inspired in Minsky and others? How to
Well,
interact
yeah,
productive
yeah.
and financial sector forces in a structuralist approach?
I think uh, already aspects of structuralist macroeconomics is dealing with the question of financial fragility along the lines of Minsky and others. Okay, that is, as soon as you bring in the stocks and flows, we look at what the financial stocks are and how they can cause financial bubbles, or how uh, so-called technological change or financial innovation actually creates new financial instruments that hide what is going on more and more through derivatives and all of these stuff, which create expectations more necessary because you don't know what's going on out there. Okay, so part of this is happening. Microcredit, I think, is something that I have more concerns about, because I think part of it is too much to promote self-employment rather than, and keeping poor people poor with a little bit more than before. Okay, now I think some of this is having incremental and good effects, and but I don't think it is simply a matter of promoting entrepreneurship, although I don't think one should look down upon anybody, especially those who run small businesses. One needs to not rely on one or two panacea like microcredit, which has become now converted into a money-making machine. Even what's his name? Ah, Bangladeshi Muhammad Yunus, right, has talked about how microcredit has now been taken over by capitalism. Okay, so I think that finance is probably, as I was mentioning before, the biggest cancer within capitalism. That is, to produce magic, to seduce the world, and to concentrate wealth in ways that are terrible. But we have the opportunity of fighting it. Okay, not through revolution, by killing people, but by stopping to buy this nonsense. Okay, stopping trying to get loans to do things like to some extent credit is good. Okay, why wait for till you die to buy a home? But why do you have to buy a huge home? Okay, the home I'm living in it's nonsense. Okay, now you might say, well, now that you're doing it, you say it's nonsense, but really, to think about the simple life and the simple pleasures of life, be it of loving other people, being it contemplation and friendship a la Aristotle, or be it like trying to understand yourself like Gandhi and Buddha. We have to take all of these into consideration, not just industrialization. We have to pick and choose, I think. And structuralism only tells part of the story, not all of it. So yes, finance is being taken into account, has to be taken into account. But in fact, these randomized trials done by my compatriot, like Abhijit Banerjee, I think is making the whole thing into a science, which along the lines of medicine, which in fact is not very scientific in itself. Okay, as we can tell, but certainly all of this should be focused on what it is doing to the human being, and not making them just capitalists to be followed by everyone else. Economic development, I think, as understood commonly, makes the rich want to get richer, and the poor, if they get richer, feel worse because of what they see around themselves as greed and not wanting even more. So even if income rises for them, they feel, especially if government support for them falls, feel and have reason to feel much worse. Okay.
Professor Dutt, this talk of you about how much is enough is the title of Skidelsky's book that I have read
Yes.
2 or 3 years ago, and about precisely that, this question, the limits of personal accumulation of wealth. Yes, I think that is a good data in our personal experience tells to us that money is good until a certain threshold level. Of course, misery and poverty, nobody can be happy if do not have a decent home, to have a decent food, to have a decent education, and so on and so forth. But the question is you are absolutely right, that in Western societies, people are induced to accumulate, and consumption, and to increase their levels of consumption, so on and so forth. So I completely agree with your concerns about the limits to personal accumulation of wealth. And I use it in my own life. I'm not rich, but I have the standard of living. That is, I have a comfortable life. I can do whatever I like, and I have no. Can express my own ideas with liberty because I have no compromises with no economic groups. So that makes me happy. I can be wrong in my ideas, but I have freedom to defend that. But, and there is a question that I think that is important. When we look to the entire world, we see an absolutely unequal distribution of income between countries, not only inside the countries. I know that the income distribution in Europe and the United States in the last 40 years is becoming more concentrated. But the income distribution between countries is also increasing in concentration. So how I think that we can tell to the citizens of Germany or United Kingdom or France that they do not have to be so worried about personal wealth accumulation, but you cannot say this to the poor people in poor countries. So we have to develop them. You have in order to develop them, you have to change the structure of production and employment.
You're going back to the
task
structure
is
of
how to
production.
do that.
Okay.
How to do that. I agree.
Well,
it's not an easy task, but without change the structure of production and employment in poor countries will be poor forever. And the standard of living of millions of people will not increase to this threshold level in which, like Keynes, we can work 5-6 hours a day. And that's thesis. This thesis was defended also by Thomas More in his book Utopia, published in the century 16.
Who?
Thomas More,
Oh,
the one that
Utopia.
was headed
Utopia.
by, yes,
Utopia.
Utopia, yes. The same
Well,
idea.
he wanted private property to be abolished.
Yes. And you know that he's saint of the Catholic Church. He was proclaimed saint.
Because Henry VIII killed him, right?
Yes. He has defended the faith. So he was
No,
a martyr.
I agree with everything that you say. Well, many things. However, I want that we rethink what the meaning of poverty is. Okay. Now, I think there is real misery. I come from India and I see people who are in horrible conditions. Africa, many countries, they live horrible lives. Okay. And there's no point romanticizing it. Okay. That
Right.
poverty is good. It is not. Okay. But I think the world can be divided into two kinds of people, okay, not good and bad. The people who, by any standards, need to improve their material standard of living, okay, and the way to do that is by redistribution, okay, to some extent, okay, not just to make them work, but to give them enough food, medical care, okay, and education. If we educate them that, okay, you got to get a job and get rich, okay, that is not education, okay. So when you say 6 hours of work, you must question what work means, okay. You and I don't work, we have fun. Okay? I wish everybody could do that, okay. And is that possible? Well, to a larger or smaller extent, I think we have to try to do that. Okay. But also these basic needs up to a certain level, there is no magic levels. Some of these people run regressions to find the level, but that also depends on the rest of society. Okay. As we know, right? So now for the other people like you and me, we can only decide for ourselves how much is enough for us. Okay. And we can talk to each other, share ideas, but there will be some among us who will refuse that in the name of liberalism. Okay. I will do what I want. Who are you to tell me? They have to be restricted by taxation and redistribution.
Yes.
Okay.
I completely agree.
Not to redistribute to others, but just to destroy their wealth. Okay. Now, that alone will be an improvement. Okay. I don't care about leaky buckets. Buckets can leak. Okay. But you have to diminish their power. How do you do that? By democratic means. We have seen enough revolutions to know how revolution centralizes power and creates good people into bad ones who just want to stay in power and to destroy their opponents. Okay. Even good people have done that.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And why is that any better than capitalism, where people who make money want to keep others down and run the show? Okay. So I think that a democratic means is partly education, partly talking about heterodox ideas and questioning what capitalism does to redefine. Capitalism is not having some money and buying and selling is okay. But if that is the only goal, get richer and richer and richer, and ultimately not by producing, but even production, unlike what Joseph Stiglitz says, is not productive. if you're just selling worthless goods to people just by creating their tastes, why is that any better than finance? Okay, so it's not just rent seeking versus production. All of the rich people are doing rent seeking, okay, in that sense, whether it's financial or production, by exploiting people. Okay, so really we need to think about at three levels how to improve conditions for the poorer people who are poor by any standards, by giving them money, by giving them food, by not as charity, but as rights. Okay. We have to think about ourselves and how many of us will try to question what success means. Okay. A successful person is not somebody who has more money. In fact, I would say people who have lots of money have done it usually by totally unethical and illegal means. Okay.
Yeah.
I think Christ and Gandhi were right. Okay. About this. Okay. That rich people are the sinners. Okay. Now, I don't think we should kill them, but we should tax them to the extent possible and not make them into heroes who should be worshipped. You know, this guy, what's his name? This fellow, Telsa fellow, what's his name? Um, um, you know,
Tesla.
the what?
Musk, Elon Musk.
Musk, yeah, that guy. Okay, why is he given so much attention? The guy's a complete idiot with some good technological ideas, but why is he worshipped? Okay, why is Bezos worshipped? Why are the Donald Trump worshipped by so many people who are known to be bad criminals, okay, and badly ethical people who just, you know, so we have to change our thinking of we should ban the Olympics. Why is running first? Well, I don't really mean that, but competition should be not so much emphasized as success and glory and we will be number one, but rather cultures that will try to make people flourish and structures that will make possible that. So I have to admit, I have to argue against you. To change production structures is just following the good old Western capitalist way. Okay. And it's not Western anymore, it's become global. China is becoming the same way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Precisely.
And so is India. And that's actually making inequality worse, as you say. Okay. And democracy is not going to be the answer by itself, because unlike what people in Britain thought by making adult universal vote, you know, they have learned how to make people into ignorant people who love toys. Anyway.
Well, Gabriel, do you have any other question?
No, it's okay. I found it very interesting. The reflections on, and I think that we are in very good company here because Keynes and many others wrote so interesting things about what a good life means. And I would also just to recall John Rawls and all the discussion about political philosophy, but the idea of Rawls that the critical challenge is how to make everyone a meaningful cooperative person in our society. It's not just givers and receivers, but also how anyone can feel being part, a meaningful part in cooperation in our society. And I think this is very much to what Professor Dutt was pointing at, if I understood well his words.
Yes,
Thank you.
I don't know if you remember a book by Albert Hirschman called The Passions and the Interest.
Yes.
Mhm.
I had liked that book, but I think that Christianity produced capitalism, okay, by focusing on interests. But capitalism is not about interests, it's about passions, it's about greed, it's about domination. Okay. And maybe violence, which was supposed to be the passionate thing, is better because the bad people kill each other. Okay.
Well,
And in fact,
according to
yeah.
Max Weber, is the Protestant version of Christianity that produces capitalism. It's just an observation.
Well, I think all of these people, including Rawls and Keynes, have some words of wisdom, but a lot of hubris as well.
Probably.
Well, I think that we do not have any other questions for the audience. We are just running out of time. In the behalf of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group, I want to thanks to Professor Amitava Krishna Dutt to giving this wonderful lecture for us today, and invite him, if you want, to participate in our second international workshop. We have a call for papers open and until May 14, and it'll be a great pleasure to have you again with us between 8 and 10 of June of this year. But many thanks, Professor Amitava Dutt. I also thanks to Cassia Kamenah for the support, technical support for this webinar today. And also thanks to my friend, my old friend, José Gabriel Persili Meireles from NECLAC to have joined us and to improve the quality of the debates made today. So that's all, folks. Thanks very much, Professor.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very
later.
much for listening and giving me the chance to talk. I hope that I did not criticize structuralism too much, but as you can see, I think it is good, but it needs to be complemented with many, many other things, because our minds are not given structures. Okay, our souls are not given structures, and we can change it to some extent, or we can let it be taken over by capitalist structures. Okay.
Perfect, Professor. Many thanks. So,
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And yeah,